Mayor Studebaker. Councilors Manns. O'Neill.
Here.
Lamont.
Here.
Wynn.
Here.
Wendland.
Here.
And Kohlhoff.
Here.
Would you stand and join me in the flag?
One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
First order of business is citizen comment. Mr. Archer, Tom Archer.
Hello, my name is Tom Archer. I live at 801 Atwater Road, and I'm here to talk about Atwater Road safety. Vehicles cresting the top of the hill on Atwater Road at night are compromising their safety. The hill has a slope between 11 and 14%. There are approximately 450 feet of new road surface that was created recently by the development on the south side of Atwater. There's very little illumination from the existing homes on the north side, as most are set a fair distance back. There's been no development, no structures built on the south side yet, so there's zero there. And drivers are blind to the road boundary. There exist 4 driveway stubs on that side and a swale. The shoulder is roughly 3 feet, the swale's 8, the pathway's about 6, which means there's no real visual clues at all on the south side for at least 17 feet. It's easy to drive on the pavement of a driveway stub and feel like you're still on the road, but be surprised when you enter a swale. At the end of the new pavement, the first visual clue of the older existing pavement extends to a concrete sidewalk, and that offset begins mid-swale. Thus, you may get a sense of security that the road surface is somewhere in that boundary and you've got a tire right in the swale. This spring, I assisted drivers of 3 such missed excursions into the swale. 2 were able to extricate themselves, and the 3rd required a tow. However, there's physical evidence that additional misadventures on both sides of the street has occurred. After the first miss, I talked with Assistant Public Works Director Jim Bateman in March regarding establishing a visual boundary for safety. He was happy to help with the solution. However, he stated that he would include this in next year's fiscal budget, which starts July 1st, and the actual implementation would occur sometime after that date. On Tuesday, April 23rd, the family developing the property, their consulting firm, the contractor, and a city engineer were finalizing a punch list for the conclusion of the project. At that time, they realized that the swale was going to need to be repaired because of the folks that had driven off of it. After the 2 additional incidents that I helped with, I called Assistant Public Works Director Rachel Sykes. I shared with Rachel the safety and liability issues of the current situation, in particular at night, how it was nearly impossible to gather any visual distinction between the street, the shoulder, and the swale. Rachel stated a fog line may have to wait until after July 1st. However, some type of temporary measure may be available, she stated, such as reflectors and/or a minimum striping situation. Rachel was surprised that there is no street light on that portion of the road, and she said she would ask Ed Marson why. At that time, Jim Bateman was on vacation, but Rachel said she would advocate to Matt, who was the AIC, which I found out later meant acting in charge, and he would call me back and share a plan. I've left messages. Yeah. I think I can finish up in maybe 20 more seconds.
All right, go for it.
Okay. The contractor has repaired the shoulder recently and the swale, and hopefully the remaining tasks on the punch list will be concluded soon. I look forward to a long-term solution. I propose a short-term solution that if you provide me with reflectors and the proper adhesive, I'll do the work. I have knee pads and a putty knife. and I saw them install the reflector for the fire hydrant, and I could be your guy. Any questions?
Thank you. Questions, Councilor Mans?
So that I understand where this is geographically, is that, where does this portion of Atwater begin and end?
Atwater Road is sort of an L shape. There's about 4 houses on a shorter section, and then there's maybe 20 houses on the longer section. And the top flat portion is in the county, but when you reach the crest of the hill, then the south side has all been incorporated in the city. I'm on the north side, I'm in the city. Some of the houses on that portion are there. But it comes down to a stop sign, which
By
is...
Cameo Court there?
No. You're...
I'm looking at a map. The other direction then, going east?
Yeah. Come towards City Hall.
Okay, going
Yeah.
east.
Yeah. If you come down Noss from Cameo, you'll enter Atwater, and about maybe a quarter to a third of a mile is where the crest of the hill is. In fact, there's a sign that says, be careful because you can't see what's on the other side. It's the
Because it
hill.
would appear most of that is county road. So you're just talking about it's like 1, 2, 3, 4 properties there before it turns into goes around the bend toward Iron Mountain?
Yeah, long before you go around the bend. In fact, there's probably 300 to 400 feet from the new road down to the stop sign. There is a light down at that stop sign for the intersection of Atwater, and Boca Raton. But from when you're standing up the hill, it's behind a nice tree, and so at night, you don't get much illumination help from that at all. Mostly you get from front porch lights on that lower portion, and that's the problem. As you come down to that lower portion, you say, oh, sidewalk, that must be the edge of the street, and so people normally, at least this is what 2 of the 3 people I helped explain to me, says, I thought the road was over there because I could see the edge of the sidewalk.
Got that part. Got it.
But that newer portion is, you're just sort of in the dark, literally.
No pun, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Archer. No more questions, thanks.
Thank you.
Our next item on our agenda is a study session on tree permitting activity.
Good afternoon, Council, Mayor. My name is Jessica Numanaloo. I'm a planning manager for the Development Review Division. And I was asked to present tonight, or this afternoon at the study session, in order to familiarize the council with tree removal and protection regulations, as we do have a couple of new council members that began at the beginning of this year. As well as provide an update on tree permit activity following the tree code amendments that took effect in 2016. The last update that I gave to the City Council was in September of 2017, in which I gave an update on permit activity that had occurred in the year following the 2016 code amendments. My presentation for you today, we're going to do a general overview of tree regulations as well as the 2016 tree code amendments, very brief. Then I'll present data on tree permitting activity between 2014 and 2018 that will hopefully illustrate the potential effects that the 2016 tree code amendments had after they were implemented. So let's start with the purpose of the tree code. The purpose is to preserve the wooded character of the city and to protect it as a natural resource, and this is done through regulating both the removal and the protection of trees. And I want to note that the city has had a tree code since the 1970s. I believe 1973 was the first tree code. At that time, trees were first regulated when they were being removed for commercial, multifamily, or subdivision type developments. It wasn't regulated on single family lots. But over time, the regulations have been expanded so that we now regulate trees that are, any tree that's 6 inches in diameter or greater for removal anywhere in the city for any purpose. A permit is required to remove any tree, as I said, that's 6 inches in diameter or greater. We have 9 different permit types in the city, depending on the reason for removal, but all but the type 2 and the verification and major forest management permits are all over-the-counter permits, so relatively easy to obtain. Though some of them sometimes require verification by staff if the applicant hasn't provided the proper information. But we do try to help applicants out. So just very quickly, the invasive is a free over-the-counter permit. It allows the removal of 12 specific invasive tree species that are identified in our city's, we have a invasive tree removal guide, so only those species qualify. The dead tree permit is pretty self-explanatory. It's a $19 over-the-counter permit, allows the removal of dead trees or trees that are dying in a progressive, irreversible state of decline. Hazardous trees is a $19 over-the-counter permit. These are for trees that are split, cracked, leaning, or diseased to the extent that they're likely to fall and injure persons or property. But it also includes trees that are damaging private or public water or sewer lines. Before the 2016 code amendments, we had problems where folks would have a water line that was burst due to tree root intrusion, and they had to get a type 2 tree removal permit, which took a month to get because we didn't have a provision for a hazard tree to remove it as a hazard tree, and now we do. Emergency trees is a free over-the-counter permit, and that's to remove trees that are in immediate danger of falling. A lot of times those trees have partially fallen over, the soil is heaving, they could be resting on the house, they could be resting on another tree. These can be obtained retroactively, so someone does not, if it happens over the weekend, someone doesn't have to wait to get a permit. They can remove it and then come in and get the free permit retroactively. Type 1 permit, as I'll allude to later, is our most popular type of permit. It is a $19 over-the-counter permit. It allows an applicant to remove up to 2 trees per calendar year that are between 6 and 15 inches in diameter. There are a few qualifiers, however. It has to be on a developed single-family lot. Can't be in sensitive lands, can't be in the Oswego Lake setback, can't be a heritage tree, and there's some other eligibility requirements as well. Verification, this permit is required following approval of tree removal that's associated with a land use application. So if somebody, for instance, had a subdivision and required public improvements, they may have gotten approval to remove, say, 3 trees to put in a sidewalk. Then the verification tree permit is something they would apply for later because there's often a lag time between when they get their land use approval and when construction actually begins. And that is just a process for staff to go out there to verify that the correct trees are coming out that were approved as part of the land use decision. Forest management permits regulate trees on large forested tracts, and that's defined as properties with 1 or more acre of canopy cover, except for it doesn't cover if it's in sensitive lands, you can't get a forest management permit. We don't get too many of those, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over it, and I don't spend a lot of time, or actually any time covering it in the presentation. Same with topping permits. Those are only allowed for utility companies, and we get very few per year, so I'm not going to spend much time on those. Type 2 is one of the other most common permit types. That one is one that is not over the counter. It costs about $200, and each additional tree adds $19 to the cost. And it's for trees that don't qualify for any of the other permit types and are removed for landscaping or development purposes. This permit is subject to public notice as well as appeal. It takes about 3 weeks to process, which includes the notice and appeal periods. We also have tree protection regulations, and tree protection is required before an applicant, they have to get a permit before they can begin development activities on a site. So it might be associated with a development permit, like a land division, could be a building permit or a plumbing permit. And what it requires is 4-foot tall metal fencing around the drip line of the tree. And this is inspected by staff before construction can begin. Sometimes, actually fairly frequently, work has to occur under the drip line of the tree. If that is the case, it has to be, the plan has to be prepared by a certified arborist. And if any excavation activities happen under the drip line of the tree, it must be overseen by a certified arborist. Our code enforcement staff inspect these, and they can also put conditions of approval on the tree permit applications, tree protection applications to assure that trees are adequately protected. In 2016, well, actually, it was started in 2015, the council appointed about a 30-member committee that we called the Ad Hoc Tree Committee, and I was the staff person that helped shepherd that along. And at that time, they convened this committee in order to take a look at the tree code and have them make recommendations to the council on amendments. The council had a very specific charge, and I'm going to read that to you so you understand what the charge of the council was to the committee. And that was to review the tree code to recommend ways to reduce the regulatory burden on residents while meeting the intent of the tree code. They also charged them to reduce staff time and administrative overhead with the regulations, use clear and objective criteria where possible, and to approach the project as amendments, not a wholesale replacement or repeal of the tree code. As you can imagine, there was a lot of differing opinions on that committee. We had plenty of people who felt that our tree code did not protect trees enough. We also had a lot of very passionate people who thought that we overregulated trees and it affected their private property rights. So it was a difficult process, but in the end, the committee was able to make recommendations that followed the council's charge. And the council ended up adopting those recommendations, which became effective in August of 2016. They adopted all of the main recommendations. The only change that the council made was that for type 1 permits, it used to be that type 1 permits were for trees that were between 5 and 10 inches in diameter, which is relatively small. The committee had recommended that it be raised to between 6 and 12 inches in diameter, but ultimately the council decided to have type 1s be eligible between 6 and 15 inches in diameter. So in addition to raising the type 1 threshold size, the council did end up adopting other recommendations of the committee, including increasing the size of regulated trees from 5 to 6 inches in diameter. Dead tree permits were redefined to include trees that are in an irreversible and progressive state of decline but aren't completely dead. Activities that require a tree protection permit were expanded to include plumbing permits, and those are things like when people put in residential sprinklers, those used to not be covered but under tree protection, as well as work within the public right-of-way. Those both now are activities that require tree protection permit. The type 2 criteria were refined to be more clear and objective. They are not currently fully clear and objective, but there's at least a little more criteria to follow to determine if a tree is significant. And then the type 2 process time was reduced by 1 week, and a notice of decision was required to be posted online rather than requiring a second sign to be posted at the site by staff. So it did reduce the overall time frame it takes to get a type 2 permit, as well as reduce staff time because they no longer had to go out to each site to post a second sign. Staff also implemented a few non-code related recommendations that the committee recommended, and that included website improvements as well as data collection. And I want to personally thank Wes Pay in our IT department, because he created this application online which allows people to view any type 2 tree cutting permit pending or approved in the city. It allows people to submit public comments online, and it's just been a much bigger improvement in the amount of data available to citizens on type 2 tree applications. It also allows us to collect a lot more data than we did before, which I'll go over here in a few minutes. So next, I'm going to be presenting data on tree permit activity between 2014 and 2018. As I mentioned, the last update to the council was in 2017, September. There are a couple of things I want to note that I did talk about in the staff memo, but it bears worth repeating. that when I was compiling the data for this study session, I noticed some discrepancies between the data that we got from the tree application that our IT department created versus the data that I was getting from Acela, which is a state system that we use for our building permits as well as our tree permitting. And we can run reports from Acela, but there's much less data than we can get from the tree app that our IT department created. After looking into it further, what we found out was that when we were doing reports on Acela previously, it only gives us 1,000 lines of results. So anything that exceeds 1,000 lines is not being captured. And when I found this out, I realized that the data that I presented back in 2017 undercounted tree permits, which we had no idea. Our support staff had no idea either. We now know, we have a workaround, and I just want you to know that all the data that I'm presenting to you tonight should be correct, that it has the full range of permittings. Before we said we issued about 1,000 tree permits a year. Actually, it's more in line of about 1,500 to 1,800 tree permits per year. And that's all tree permit types, not just type 2. I also want to note that the 2016 code amendments went into effect late in 2016 in August, so we only have 4 months of data from 2016. So some of the more detailed data that I'm going to present will not have data from 2016 for that reason, because we only have 4 months of data. In addition, you will note that we have data from 2015, but the reason we do is because we had an intern for the ad hoc tree committee who compiled that data manually, which is very time intensive. But we did not have his availability for other years. So you will see some data which only has data from 2015, 2017, and 2018. But we will continue to collect this, and if the council wishes, we can provide reports later on, and we'll compile more and more years of data. So this chart shows the number of tree permits that were applied for by permit type, and this is between 2014 and 2018. And note that the vertical dash line shows when the 2016 code amendments went into effect. I know it's a little bit convoluted. There's a lot of information on here, and I do not have all the permit types. I just kind of highlighted sort of the main ones. But I thought it was good to show it all at once because you can kind of see how the different tree permit types have changed over time in terms of the number of permits applied for. Since the threshold for type 1 permits was increased in 2016, as would be expected, we saw an increase in the number of type 1 applications and a corresponding decrease in the number of type 2 applications. Prior to 2016, there were more type 2 applications applied for than type 1. But type 1 applications, as you know, overtook it in 2016 and has remained higher in the 2 years since. What this seems to indicate is that the council's charge of decreasing the regulatory burden on property owners is being accomplished because property owners are able to remove less significant trees more easily with an over-counter permit that costs $19 rather than having to go through a type 2 permit, which takes about 3 weeks and is $200 or more. For dead tree permits, the general upward trend after 2016 is up. And we would expect that because the number of dead tree permits, the number of trees eligible for a dead tree permit increased after 2016 because we added trees that were in an irreversible progressive state of decline as well. Other highlights are, and one other thing I would note for dead tree permits is that sometimes there's severe weather events that occur, and it can take a while for that to affect a tree. So if there was a drought, or if there was a drought and then a really heavy rain year, that could affect trees and could cause a lot of trees to die. And we may see a lag effect in people applying for tree permits because it takes some time for that to affect the trees. For hazard tree permits, they've generally declined since 2014. And I was trying to figure out why that might be because we actually expanded the number of trees that might be eligible for hazard because we said, well, if it's also damaging like a water or sewer line, that could qualify as hazard. But one of the things that the ad hoc committee also recommended and the council adopted was to require tree risk assessor arborists, which is a special certification they have to get in order to submit for a hazard tree. So that may have caused it to, people to basically not want to apply for that because it may be a little harder, a little bit more expensive to find those types of arborists. This is just a guess on my part, but I just found that a little puzzling because I thought we might see that actually rise after 2016. Invasive permits have remained fairly steady, which is expected because we didn't really make any changes to invasive tree permits in 2016. Tree protection permits have increased, as would be expected, because plumbing permits and public improvement projects were added as activities that require tree protection. And I would note that we've also seen an increase in issued tree violations, and this would be both tree removal as well as tree protection violations. In 2016, there were 21 violations, there were 29 in 2017, and there were 28 in 2018. And this just reiterates or emphasizes, that we saw the change in the type 1, the proportion of type 1 versus type 2 after 2016. You can see that it flipped and there were more type 1s than type 2s. There's also overall a lot of permits in 2017. As you can see, it looks like a lot more than some of the other years. I just wonder if after the tree cutting permit regulations, there's a lot of people that knew that they were going to go into effect and they may have delayed or decided to take out trees thinking that it might be easier. I don't know, but there might have been some pent-up demand because the numbers did come down in 2018. Big storm. Oh, yeah, that's true. Okay, so who are applying for type 2 permits? So when we get an application before we assign it, we fill out certain data in our tree app that the IT department created. And we have to decide if an applicant is a single-family owner, a single-family builder, developer, or other. And what that means is we will assign an applicant type as a single-family owner if it's an application involving a single-family lot and the removal is for landscaping, damage to existing structures or infrastructure, poor tree health or thinning, or to construct a small accessory structure or additions to an existing home by a private property owner. If it is for a single-family lot that is either a newly created lot by a land division, or if it's a redevelopment of an existing lot, we will assign it as builder developer, even if that builder or developer is the property owner, or they are building a custom home for a property owner. And the reason why we do this is because we got a lot of questions and we get a lot of perception out there that all the trees are coming down for development purposes. And development in this city is primarily residential. We do have commercial development, but because we're primarily residentially zoned city, that's where we see a lot of the tree removal. So we really try to tease out the difference between, say, a commercial development versus single-family development versus just people just doing landscape projects on their site. Other property or other applicant types include commercial, institutional, industrial property owners, the city, other jurisdictions, or homeowners associations. As you can see here, the vast majority of type 2 applications are filed by single-family property owners. In 2015, well, in the years here, roughly 70% of the applicants were single-family owners, about 20% were builders or developers, and the rest 10% were other applicant types. As would be expected, because they're the largest applicant types, single-family owners do remove the most type 2 trees. However, builders and developers tend to request more trees on average per application. So a single-family owner would request on average about 2 trees per application, whereas a developer builder would request about 4 trees on average per application. The other applicant types requested on average between 3 to 6 trees per application. However, you have to note that those are typically probably associated with larger lands than single-family lots. Some additional data, the average size of the trees requested for removed by builders or developers was slightly less than single-family homeowners. The average size in these 3 years, the trees ranged from about 19 to about 23 inches in diameter for single-family property owners. For builders or developers, it was about 18 to 22 inches. and for other applicant types, it was about 14 to 22 inches in diameter. Overall, property owners removed about half of all type 2 trees requested, and builder and developers removed about a third, and the other applicant types removed the rest. Some of the other data that we're able to get is what are the species of trees that are being removed. I will note that some applicants are better at identifying tree species than others. I had one application where they said they were taking out a maple. We went out there and it was a Douglas fir. So we can't always rely on the applicant. So I will say that when we do encounter those errors, we will correct them in our data, but you know, realize that there's probably going to be some amount of tree species that are still misidentified. As you can see, Douglas fir account for about a quarter of all type 2 tree removal applications. And, you know, that isn't a big surprise because that is a native tree species and it's probably a predominant tree type in the city. Next up was maples, and then cedars, pines, and oaks. And then because the pie chart just becomes unreadable when you parse it out too much, we just lumped all the rest of them into other tree types. But this gives you a general idea of the types of trees that are coming out. I also want to note this doesn't, other than the Douglas fir, the maple, that could be a native maple, it could be a red maple, it could be a Japanese maple. It's just generally the maple species. This is my last slide. This table was attached to the memo you received, and it shows the total number of type 2 applications applied for between 2014 and 2018. As well as the number of those apps that were either approved, denied, or there's one category of withdrawn, voided, or put on hold. And I want to point out that while, you know, there aren't a lot of applications that staff denied, but this is very misleading because people will often apply for multiple trees on one tree application. And if we don't deny the whole tree permit, then it's not going to show up in this data. Staff frequently denies a partial application, but it will show up as the application being totally approved because some of the trees were approved. A lot of times people will withdraw an application instead of getting a denial because we offer a partial refund, and if they know that they don't want to appeal the application, then they will just ask to withdraw the application and get a partial refund of their application fee. Just as an example, in 2017, there was a total of 968 type 2 trees that were requested to be removed, but 764 were actually approved. So there were 204 trees in there that were not approved, and largely that was probably due to staff either saying they were going to deny it and those trees were withdrawn, or it was voluntarily withdrawn, or it could have been voided. But staff does partially deny quite a few applications, and so we don't approve every single tree that comes over as a type 2. This chart also shows the number of appeals of staff's decisions received for type 2 applications between 2014 and 2018. And it's kind of odd. It's been a pattern. Every other year it's either 2 or 4. So it's remained pretty steady, but as you can see, a number of them were actually withdrawn too, so not all the appeals went through. But we have not seen a real increase in appeals over this time period. So this concludes my presentation for you this afternoon. Certainly if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. If I am not able to answer a question, I'm happy to follow up later.
Councilor Kohlhoff.
So, couple of things. First of all, thank you. I thought that it was really very helpful that you actually put the charge in. I never read your charge, which made a lot of sense as to why the people were not to go off those rails. Those rails were very narrow. So that was helpful. And I also was very happy to see that you recorded the recommendations that people were trying to get in and were not, because of that narrow charge, allowed to do that. So those have not been discussed. But I did want to clarify a little bit, looking at your chart, that all told, in the years 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, oh, shoot, hold on. There were 21,234 trees taken out. That's adding up on attachment 2, page 1 of 2. Yes, some of them were dead, some of them were emergency and the like, but the nut of that coconut is 21,234 trees were taken out. Let's look at the type 1 and the type 2, because as I understood what you said, it was a little confusing. It sounded like there were only 1,800 or so in total. But of those, the type 1, in those years, there was 1,671. So 1,671 type 1s came out. And I'm assuming that includes the fruit trees and whatnot. But as it relates to the type 2, which have been kind of the bone of contention, at least the ones that come up before us, there's 1,596 during those years, or a total, in other words, of trees that we might say, well, gosh, those are trees, 3,267. So, I think that and the thing that's more concerning to me was the fact that, at least in the 2 years, 24% were Doug firs, which I'm assuming was not really discussed at the tree code or the tree charge, or you would have raised that. But what is concerning is that those are the ones most likely to survive climate change. So with that clarification, for those who are listening, I thought you were saying there was like 1,800 a year, which there kind of is, looking at attachment 2. But when you work with the numbers, it's a significant amount of trees that are under an average of about 20 inches in diameter. Those are big trees.
I don't know where you're getting those numbers. I was trying to follow you when you were speaking, but the table 1, which is, I believe you're referring to, that is the number of applications, not the number of trees.
Attachment 2 on table 2 shows that there was an application of 1,737, of which you approved 1,596, and those were the numbers I was using. I was just doing the calculator.
Oh, did you added them up all together on table 2?
On the year 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, if you add the ones approved,
Yes.
it's 1,596. If you go up to the table of type 1, and those are not as significant as maybe type 2, but they are still under, give or take 15 inches. You add those up by the year and you have 1,671, which is where I got the 3,267. My point isn't good, bad, or indifferent. What I'm trying to say is that when you take a 5-year slice and you realize that those trees are coming out about an average of 20 inches, that's a lot of tree removal.
I don't get the same count. Not even close. I get 8,234, what your bottom numbers total to.
Yeah.
Correct.
Table 1.
I concur.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And that's the number of applications. It's not telling you how many trees were applied for in each application. So for type 1s, for instance, you're allowed to remove up to 2 trees per type 1, but not everyone applies for 2 trees. Some of them only apply for 1.
But the number on the bottom is the number of trees, though, right? In the
No,
count?
on table 1, the number at the bottom, the total is the number of permits applied for, applications, not the
Count
number
is
of
the
trees.
permits. All right, so is
Yeah.
that on the other one we were going through?
So then how do we find out how many trees?
For the number of trees, we don't have that information available for type 1, dead, hazard, because that is all data that we'd have to track manually because it's not something that we can put into a CELA. So we do have the data for type 2s, which I believe is in Table 3. That tells you the total number of trees removed in 2015, 2017, and 2018, which is like 793, 764, and 564. Those were the total number of type 2 trees, but that doesn't account for the other tree permit types.
Councilor Mans.
I had a comment on something that is not germane to this, so if someone else had a question or wanted to make a comment on this, I'll defer.
Okay. Councilor Lamont.
First question is, clarify again, topping. We don't allow topping permits. We don't want trees topped, right?
Only utility companies can apply for topping permits.
Well, then the question there is, because I noticed it again the other day, is if they're just taking a branch off, pruning or trimming, I get that, but we keep getting the goalposts on our main roads when they're chopped down and done. Why wouldn't they just take the whole tree out? It can't be good when they're cutting the whole middle of the tree out. Why did they leave them? That's the question.
Mayor and
PG,
Council,
I mean.
and Mayor Studebaker was in the meeting as well. A week ago, Friday, we met with staff from PG, including the CEO, and they were sensitive to that concern, and they said they're trying to do a better job of having arborists work with their tree contractor to do a cleaner job, and frankly, to do that, if it's getting to the point where there's just a stump, to go ahead and take the whole tree.
The second question was, the mayor and I, during the storm a year ago, got complaints about people assuming that PG wasn't cutting trees down, or people weren't taking trees out that were in emergency that fell down on a driveway, they're leaning in a house, until they got a permit. Now, you're clarifying that emergency, you can take it out if it's emergency,
Absolutely.
and then worry about the permit later. So
Correct.
I remember you brought it up, I brought it up, but I think for the public to clarify, if it's emergency, get it out, and then we can worry about the permit later. The next thing is mitigation trees. If somebody has to mitigate 10 trees on their site and they can only get 3 in, they then contribute 7 trees worth of dollars to the tree fund. Is that correct?
Yes, that is a possibility.
Okay, and we're not tracking how many mitigation trees, who did what and where.
We do track mitigation
Right,
trees,
so
yes.
if the Smith property had 7 that have to go off-site, 3 on-site, you guys are watching that, but the 7 that go in the tree fund, are we tracking the actual trees in the tree fund? I know that Ivan has given us a clarification on the tree fund, but are we tracking that 10 were planted in this park, or 12 were planted in this right-of-way, or?
So we have a very limited ability to allow tree planting off-site. Before the 2016 tree code amendments, it did actually say you could plant trees on city property in lieu of planting if they didn't have a room on site. However, by recommendation of parks, actually, they cannot take in these individual requests and then track these all over town. It's just too much work, and it's not very efficient.
So the
And-
7 trees go to the tree fund, and then the
Yes.
city takes care of it from
Right,
there.
and then it just goes into a lump sum to that tree fund, and then we use that for tree planting in the city.
Okay, next question is, have we done any informal interviews with property owners, individual property owners, not developers or builders, on their experience at the desk getting the type 1 or type 2 permits?
No,
May want to do that informally, just to talk to some folks of what they've run into. And also, I'm the liaison at DRC, and last night, trees came up again, as you
Yes,
know,
they did.
and they seem to be struggling with it. We may want to interview them and find out what they need to make it smoother. And then my last one is, when a developer comes in, now we're going to the development side, 2016, or 15 or 16, the tree committee recommended we look at the development code, which we have not done in 3 years. I think it's a simple solution, but some people want to complicate it. I think we're looking at the opposite side of the equation. Builders or developers can clear cut their whole site, and then they will get a permit for each one of those trees that they would take out. So if they're going to take 14 out on a site, they have to get a type 2 tree permit for every single tree. Is that correct? Or is it one joint permit?
oh, it can be one joint permit.
Okay, so the tree code is one thing, and the development code is another. They do not connect. We don't need to merge them. But what we need to do is finally address, I've been on this soapbox, address the residential development code, which allows a builder to clear cut a site and then go and get the permits. So I was very encouraged, as Director Siegel knows, when you guys came up with those incentives for Lake Grove on Boones Ferry, we can set the buildings back from the 10-foot build line. We can actually amazingly preserve a Douglas fir with the ground around it and let them not have to put in landscaping with a 3-inch whip to replace it. So my question is, because I'm at the wit's end on this, nobody's talking about anti-development, nobody's talking about little tiny houses, nobody's talking about obstruction of justice, nobody's talking about taking property rights on. Why can't we do the same thing for the residential properties and encourage the developers to preserve in the front end whatever they can, whatever's in the footprint's got to go. And if on a tight site in First Edition, there's just no way to save the tree, I get it. But it seems like on the Toma Road thing, for example, the neighborhoods had to appeal it, the citizens had to appeal it, your staff time was a lot, DRC had to get it, we had to get it, and then we told him to save 4 trees, and then he did it. He could have done that in the beginning and saved everybody a hassle. So how do we flip this so there's an ethic or ethos that these builders will preserve as many trees as they can, but still build? Could we do the same similar incentives? Could we cut down the cost on their tree permits if they save some? To me, it's a simple solution just ready to go. What can we do to make the residential line up with the commercial?
Well, with your Toma Road example, they ended up having to reduce the size of that house. And that was not something that we were told, that was not the staff interpretation or the interpretation from prior councils or DRCs that as a reasonable alternative. So they did that, and the reason why staff didn't require them to do it is because we hadn't required that previously. But they ended up doing it, and they moved forward with the project. But the simple answer to your question is there aren't tools for staff to use. We cannot require someone to get a variance to save a tree, and unless there are outright permitted exceptions or incentives built into the code to allow maybe reduce a certain percentage of reduction to a setback or some other adjustments that could be done just as an exception to the code rather than having to go through a variance process, that would be helpful, but those mechanisms don't currently exist.
So we could work on those mechanisms. So for example, on the Toma Road one, we found there was a 10 or 15-foot setback on the north end that they could have shifted up and got a variance for the setback and pushed the house up a little bit to save those 4 trees. You said we don't have the tools to do that. But the properties behind the fireside station, they wanted 21 variances and exceptions, and staff signed off on that, even though DRC threw it out because that wasn't what RID's all about. So we can go with 21 exceptions, but we're not allowed to negotiate to move the site up a little feet to save the trees. So something's wrong with our tools. Something's wrong with our regulations, and we don't have incentives to help these developers do the right thing. There's a developer in First Edition that many people that live in First Edition think they're the poster boys for doing the right thing. They will bend over backwards to move and shift and adjust. They actually shut their own job down, as you know, when one of their contractors accidentally hit a tree. How do we get that to the ethics and ethos of our builders, who are good builders? We've got to build the city. We've got to continue to grow, to get you the tools and to get the incentives lined up. We got to do it, I think, and we could maybe take a straw poll before this is over. I'm tired of it. We're at a crossroads, in my mind.
Councilor Wendland.
I think a point of clarification, I came up with, if you count the number of type 2 trees, for 3 years, it's 2,121. And if you do it the average, if you expound it, it'd be 2,828 instead of 20,000. I think you were
That-
off one.
At my calculator, I was doing something wrong.
Okay, good.
Totally
So-
wrong, but I'll come
So
back to
over-
that. But I agree with that it was 2,121, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but leave that as alone.
So, my question, a couple things. When Oswego Lake Country Club did their renovation of their golf course, they applied for a whole bunch of tree removals and whatever. Are those incorporated in this tree removal, or do you think that was, because that was a huge number?
Yeah, it would have
And-
been. Yes, it would have been, because I'm sure that it was since 2014 that occurred. I don't remember the exact year, but I believe it falls within that timeframe. And
Okay.
it was a type 2 tree cutting permit
Right,
application.
and so I don't know, that may skew your data, because hopefully they only do that once every 50 years when they do their thing. The other thing, do we have any idea on how many trees are removed without us knowing? In other words, I know that you have a code enforcement if somebody gets caught, but do we have any sort of idea that we have a very compliant city where 90% of the people you think come in and apply for a a permit? Or do you think it's 50%? Or do you think, in other words, what I'm driving is these are the numbers that we know about because they've been permitted and we've analyzed the data. I'm wondering, do you think we have a huge problem out there where a lot of people are taking trees down without permits? And do you think we're actually removing twice the number of trees because we don't have people that are actually applying through the process correctly? Or any idea at all, or not?
Well, of course, we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
But, you know, I mentioned that there were, we get about 21 to 29 violations in the last 3 years or so that are tree protection or tree removal related. We are complaint-based, so we don't have someone driving around looking to see if someone is removing trees, although we do have diligent staff, and if they see that and they suspect there's something suspicious, they'll let us know. I tend to think that most people in this city know that we have tree regulations and act in good faith. I believe that there are going to be bad actors no matter what, that might remove trees without a permit, but it's pretty hard to do that. And we do have a lot of diligent citizens that call us every time there's tree removal and have us check on it. That happens frequently. I think probably the bigger problem has to do with mitigation trees. Because we do have enough code enforcement staff now, we do check on mitigation for all tree cutting permits that require mitigation now. Whereas we didn't a few years ago before we had the second code enforcement officer. But even after we have checked it out, those are easy for people to remove after we've verified. So to me, that tends to be the bigger problem. And I think a lot of it is just people who buy new homes, they see these small trees, they decide they don't like them, and they take them out and decide that they don't want that, or they put in something else. So to me, that would be the bigger problem rather than seeing larger trees come out without a permit.
Yeah, because I was just surprised that you only had like 21 it's a very small number of non-compliant
Right.
people, which I think is really good. It means that, I guess, we've done our communicating, and like Oswego, that you need to follow the procedures to do anything with a tree.
And that doesn't account for the complaints that they have to actually investigate. That's just what actually turned into violations.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Councilor Koloff.
So I apologize for my bad skills on my phone, but I still, and so I agree with Councilor Wendland that Table 3 does show that the total number of the trees removed was 21 for the years 15, 16, and 17. And as I think he said or alluded to, the average size of those trees was 19.64, a little under 20 inches, which is still a lot of tree. And the other thing that I had a question about, though, is how is it that we've got, if you look at Table 1, I understand that you have applications by permit type, and the total down at the bottom, I'm sure I did it right this time, is 8,237. Approximately how many of those, in your estimation, resulted in actual removal? 80%, 70%? Do we know?
Well, we don't know because when we issue a permit, we are not checking to see if people removed the actual trees. We assume they did. So is that the question you're asking? Do we know that the trees were actually removed?
Yes, it was, but that leads me to ask the question then, that wouldn't have been due to you saying you denied the application. They had the applications to cut the trees that was then approved by you, not you personally, obviously,
Yes.
planning.
Yes.
The 8,237 were approved applications.
Well, these were the applications, these are the number of applications that were applied for by permit type. It is more unusual for us to fully deny like a dead tree permit or a hazard or something like that, because people will usually come in, we'll catch it at the counter, and if we think it's not gonna fall under that permit type, like we can't approve it, then we will direct them to a different permit type or just tell them flat out that it doesn't qualify. So I don't know from this data here how many were actually approved versus denied, but most of them are approved. Because again, we try to work with the applicant to get them into the right permit type, or they may withdraw an application before it's actually denied.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Councilor Mans.
Yes, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. You had mentioned the work that West Pays and IT had done that allowed us to have a more robust idea of what's going on in the world of trees. Does that save staff time in some way, shape, form, or another?
Well, it certainly does in producing reports. It's much faster than it was before, whereas we had to do the data collection manually. He has set it up to where when it is applied for on Acela, it pulls almost all the permit information from Acela into the app, so we don't have to manually put in that information. What we generally have to change, of course, are the dates for type 2 permits for like the appeal period. We would change the status update, who's it's assigned to, and we do have to manually enter the trees because we can't get that through Acela. So there is some amount of staff time that's involved, but it's not significant. I would say we spend maybe 20 minutes or half an hour a day inputting information about type 2 tree cutting permits. There's some days where it's none at all because we don't get applications every single day for type 2s.
Sure. That feeds into my interest on smart city functions and the ability of providing transparency to citizens in order that they can have a better picture of what we're doing. The other, this is just an aside, it looked like there was a great jump in removal of fruit trees from one year to the next. I think it was 17 to 18. I didn't realize that many people had fruit trees, or B, would want to remove them.
We're no longer the Fruit Loop.
Bees.
Bees eating the fruit, not pollinating the fruit?
No, why people remove them, because they get a heavy bee
They attract
concentration.
bees?
Yes, they do.
I know they attract yellow
Well,
jackets. Okay.
bees, yellow.
Got it,
Yellow
thank you.
jacket.
Councilor O'Neill.
You know, I think the bigger question, we can talk about tree permits forever, and probably it's one of those things where we'll never get agreement from everyone. But I think the important thing that we should concentrate on is our tree canopy increasing, or is it not increasing?
That's a good question. So the only analysis that I have available that I found was from 2015, and I believe it was done for some stormwater work. They did a tree canopy analysis, and it was done using aerial photograph and infrared imaging, and they found that the tree canopy cover in the city was about 50%. All tree canopy measurement data is going to have some, flaws to it. So it's hard to say how accurate it is, but it does give us a good estimate of what the tree canopy cover is. In 2014, there was a LiDAR flyover that was done. We have not calculated the canopy cover from that yet, or we don't have a really reliable way to do that yet. There was another flyover that was done recently that the data will be available this November. And we're going to work with our GIS or perhaps a consultant to see if we can analyze the canopy cover in those 2 years, and then we can see if there's a change. But what's frustrating is that all these different, these different methodologies have limitations to them. But even since 2014, there has been a lot of changes in the technology for LiDAR. And so even those 2 years, it may not be comparing apples to apples because you may have much higher resolution in 2019 than you did in 2014. So these are things that we can look at, and hopefully when we get that data in November, put together some calculations and see if we can come up with a more accurate number than from 2015. But just realize that that data cannot be directly compared to the 2015 because it was a completely different methodology. So, and
Councilor
technology.
Nguyen.
Just had a quick question. So in terms of the tree applications, so I guess of all these types, there's in particular tree protection ones. That really doesn't result in tree removal, right? Okay, so those, so that's like between 11 and 12%, 13% of the total applications. And so just because the application comes in that particular type, there's no tree removal whatsoever. It's just.
That's correct.
Okay, just wanted to clarify because that's.
It's just it is a type of tree permit, but it's not a removal permit.
Okay, so it's
That's
not,
a
so
good
that really
point.
doesn't reduce the number of trees that, we actually have, so it's not
True.
cutting down trees. So, then the other thing is, in terms, I know that we have a very small number of illegal tree removals, right? So we're a couple dozen maybe, but what's the fine? What if somebody said, well, heck, it's, better to ask for forgiveness than permission, if they cut down a big tree, what is the fine? What's the?
It is in our fee schedule. I don't know off the top of my head, but I know that there's an enforcement fee, or there's like a enforcement fee, and then there's a fee per caliper inch. So if it's a large tree, I mean, it could be in the several thousands. But that's something that I would have to follow up
It's a
with you
civil
on.
offense. You have to go in front of the judge.
Okay, I just want to make sure that, that we're not, that somebody isn't making that business decision, well, hey,
It's not going to be fun.
It's like
It's
parking
not gonna be
illegally,
fun for the individual who.
Okay, I
It's
just want to make sure,
substantial. It's
yeah, I just
substantial.
want to make sure we have some teeth in that enforcement, so, yeah.
We look at the frequency and the history there, because the tree, as Jessica was saying, there's the enforcement fee and the restoration fee, and typically those amount to the same amount the judge imposes as what's called a presumptive fine, kind of like the bail that you can pay. But if someone is a multiple offender or has a long history, the city can write and say, please don't accept those as the presumptive fine, because there's also a fine, those are actually fees, a fine on top of that could be up to $1,000 per tree. Rarely is that imposed because, again, usually it's a one-off deal and someone may not have known. But we've had in the past some violators where that has really added up. So the teeth are available. They usually aren't necessary. But if something's bad enough, or we had one violator on the lake who cut down, said, I'll pay whatever it takes. I'm going to cut down these giant Doug firs, and ended up paying a fine of about $21,000 municipal court. I think we set a record there. But anyway, a lot of enforcement discretion that staff has depending on the circumstances.
Well, and I think his permit to build his house was stalled by 16 months or something too. So
Okay.
it was.
Councilor Lamont, you had another question?
Yes. I have heard now tonight for the fourth time that we don't have the tools. A notice crossed my desk last week that we have a project coming in and they want to adjust the setback so that they are going to get a variance or an exception for the setback. We don't seem to do that for when it comes to trees. So we understand there's no tools that you can use and there's no incentives for residential. So what do you need? Do you need us to sanction the department, because we don't have any really big projects out there, no big comp plans or whatever, to do the simple research to come back with us with some tools and incentives? And it might be monetary, it might be permit fees, it might be you don't have to do your landscape if you preserve the Doug fir, to try to get a handle on this. It's the one thing that we do not have a handle on. So I would like to take a straw poll of the councilors tonight. If it was a short 8-hour research project by our professionals in the planning department to say, are there incentives, monetary or landscape or whatever, and or tools to use to allow you to have more say in these projects for residential development? I would like to see that. I'd just like to see, could we ask the department to do that simple one-day research to do this? It would stop a lot of complaints. I still get complaints. People don't even want to file because there's so much aggravation, but they can't go after every single one. So if we can't do it on one site and someone can take them all down, it should be the reverse. I, as a builder or developer, should be saying, what can I do to help save these? And if I can't save them because of the footprints, I get that, but we don't have enough tools. We don't have enough incentives. So I would like to ask my fellow councilors, is this something you would like to see staff come back with some draft ideas for us to do? Straw poll, that's all I ask. Hand in the air, no official vote, no official motion.
That's something we can do.
You can if you wish.
John, on the goal for this, after this study
just a
session, what's our, are we proposing after the staff comes out with
How many
recommendation?
people want to see something like that? I'm not even clear what you're asking.
All right, let me clarify. Okay. We get deep into the weeds on every other type of
Just say
development.
what you're
Okay,
asking for,
but we need help with tools or incentives that I'm sure the planning department could come up with quickly. They did it for the commercial, to incentivize and to save a few trees that don't need to be cut down. Instead of coming in and cutting 35 down on a site, let's try and save a few. I think it's easier for developers to move around and builders to move around the site, but there are trees that can be saved. They don't have to all be saved. And no one is anti-development, no one's stopping, no one's saying do tiny homes. Obviously, on tight sites, footprints and foundations are gonna hurt trees. So what I would say, if there was a motion, that we sanction, empower the planning department to do this little bit of research to come back in a study session, not even a full ordinance, that says, here's some of the tools that we could use or incentives to make it easier to save trees. And maybe even there's an educational component to get the builders to understand what we're trying to get. That's all I'm asking.
Jessica? I'd rather just, before we say yes or no to that, I'd rather you give it some thought. Tell us what would be involved in something like that. Can you do that?
Or if it's even needed,
well,
since we've only had one in
you know,
6 years.
It is partly a policy question, and I wouldn't want to necessarily put Jessica on the spot on a time estimate, but what we can come back as part of that if it looks like it's going to be an involved process. And there's two parts of the staff time. One is just coming back to the council where here's some policy options for you to consider, and that probably could be relatively reasonable. Then there's a second part. If you wanted to make changes, there's another process there, and you need to know that that would take a fair amount of staff time and council time. But it's hard to say what the time would be. If it's some fairly informal tools that other cities have used, it probably wouldn't take too long, would it?
No.
Come back to, but we would come back to you and say, okay, to implement these, this is the kind of process you'd be looking at.
All I'm asking.
Yeah.
That's all I'm asking.
I guess if you feel that we're missing something in the code that is a tool that you need, I mean, do you feel that that's the case?
Well, I can tell you that there are currently not incentives built into the development code in different zoning regulations to save trees. There aren't. So we can't adjust setbacks or adjust other standards in order to accommodate trees. You know, it's complicated by other things. I mean, the size of the lot. I mean, you know, if you take First Edition, they have 6,000 square foot lots. The smaller the lot size you get, you start reducing setbacks, which are already fairly small setbacks. There's only so much you can do. But yeah, I mean, we don't have those incentives, and I see that Director Siegel here is
Creeping up
going to
here.
add something.
Thank you.
It becomes arbitrary.
I'm going to jump into the fray here because this is something that you've had some of you have had a lot of history with. And I'll tell you that if you want to provide incentives, there's very little span of control that we have on a residential lot. On a commercial lot, like what we examined with Lake Grove, we were talking about larger lots, and we were talking about standards that apply to commercial and mixed-use development that are not applicable to single-family homes. For example, in Lake Grove, there was a standard called the build-to line. The building had to be within a certain distance of the street. That was an impediment to saving trees. So the Planning Commission recommended a change to the code, and you approved it, that allowed staff, working with the applicant, creative problem-solving, good design to save some trees. Residential lots, they're smaller, they're narrower, the setbacks are 5 to 10 feet. There's just very little room to maneuver. So if you were going to ask staff to prepare a study or just a quick, you know, assessment of what's possible, it would be helpful to get some direction on, are you willing, are you open to reducing the size of the home? You know, limiting development, because I think that's really what it's going to take to save a significant number of trees through incentive, or that wouldn't even be an incentive, that would be a regulation. So
But the commercial zoning that we just changed, that you guys did great work on, Obviously, there's a 10-foot build-to line for commercial. We don't have that in residential. That incentive is not going to go for residential. But when you said, let's save a Douglas fir in the ground around it, and then you cannot have to put your little tree in, wouldn't that be easy to transfer that to residential? When you say you couldn't move the setback, and I just got a DRC or a planning department thing in the mail that said we're going to change the guy's setback to 15 feet or something instead of 20 to accommodate that site. Why can't we make that your tool to say we could shift it? We could take Toma Road up 5 feet and save those on the bottom of the site, but you told me that night you couldn't do it because of the setback. We can do it elsewhere, but we can't do it for the
Yeah,
tree.
So here's what that scenario looks like, Councilor Lamont. You can move your building over to save this tree and reduce the setback on one side in order to create more space
Right.
on the other. So now we are moving, the development closer to a neighbor's property. That could be an incentive, but there's going to be some trade-offs along the way. So we're willing to look at it, and I didn't want to
But I
take
mean,
up
I
anyone
looked through
else's
the,
time.
We can
Be
go on
here
like
all
this.
night.
Yeah, let's get it done.
Let's just go on. Thank you for your suggestions.
But what are we guiding
I don't
them?
want to,
I'd like to take a straw poll.
I know you would.
Yeah,
I don't.
I think we have people here that would like to get this resolved. Simple little research by the
Okay,
planning.
take us, how many people would like to go further on this? I don't know what
I feel
we're
like we're
talking about.
voting,
Well, it
and
sure
it's a
sounds-
study session.
Straw poll. Just,
Okay.
would you like to have a
Somebody
little bit of
would not.
research?
I'm neutral.
All right, well, it's 2-2, so it doesn't pass.
Wait, 2-2. I didn't get
That's
all.
right, John.
I didn't see all the hands. I didn't see the hands. No, we have been punting this down the
John,
road for
John,
months,
that's
for
enough.
years.
That's enough.
3 years we've been putting this off.
Next.
Well, I don't think we've been putting it off.
Oh, we
I don't
have.
think so either.
We have.
We just haven't come to what you want.
Ms. Martin,
We haven't even
thank you.
explored it, and they
Thank
can
you.
explore it in 8 hours.
Thank you very much. Did you have one more question, Councilor Koloff?
The only thing I was going to ask is whether or not a referral to the Planning Commission might be more effective than simply transferring the question over for suggestions to the Planning Department. That was my question. And I don't know that that would make a difference in the vote, but that would be the way I would approach it.
Councilor Wendland?
I would only add to that, that if there is something that the planning department needs as a tool to make Lake Oswego better in what Councilor Lamont was talking about, I think that's what we should be doing. But I'm not telling you to start making regulations to save trees, to have a footprint smaller as a disincentive for people to buy a lot. I guess if you feel that there's code that we could improve on, we should be doing that for the people of Lake Oswego. And if there's an incentive that we can do, I don't know the code well enough. You guys live it day by day. If you think there's deficiencies in the code, I mean, I'm for that, to help save trees and still have people develop the things that they want. So that I'm for, and that's what we should be doing. But I don't want, I'm not saying redevelop the whole code.
No,
Councilor O'Neill?
nobody's saying.
I think Mr. Siegel was being polite. Jessica's being polite. But what I think we're missing here, or what you might not have all of the knowledge is, we have spent the last 6 years trying not to have our code be arbitrary. And now what you're saying is let it be arbitrary.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Well, you are.
No,
Because
I never said
we
that.
have setbacks. So what you're telling our staff is to move outside of those setbacks to save a tree. So then what happens is neighbors get involved. It becomes very, well, you're putting neighbor against neighbor because you're being not subjective. You're saying, hey, let's just move it 4 inches. You'll have homes more forward or homes pushed back. Whereas you take a neighborhood where the sight line of the whole neighborhood is in line because all homes are 25 feet back and 5 or 10 feet in. But now, if you're saying staff, save a tree, one house might come forward, and then someone says, well, why did they get to move it forward? It just becomes very confusing, and it was very problematic for many, many years because we did have a code that allowed our staff to kind of move the goalpost. And it became very difficult for architects to know what to bring in that would be acceptable. I think we've done a great job in the last 6 years, and we've heard from architects that they know when they bring a plan in, as long as it meets all the rules and regulations that we've told them are the building envelope, that they can build within it.
But
So-
that's not what's happening. Staff can change it for everything else, but not the tree. I get them in the mail. I get those notices. We moved from 20 feet to 15 feet to 18 feet. They're adjusting it for other stuff, so it's not like a rigid setback line, so why not for a tree?
Well, they have to go
And
through-
the ones that are
you have
complaining,
to
the
go
neighbors
through a
want to
RID,
save the tree.
correct?
All right,
You have to go through a land use
So
application
it's not that
process.
easy. It's a
not an
RID.
outright
It's
acceptance.
$1,000. It
Right.
takes a year.
Right.
How many RIDs did we have last year?
Oh, gosh, put me on the spot.
Well, I mean, a dozen?
Yeah.
There you
Be a
go.
good guess.
Okay, it's
Sorry.
not, if we even had that.
let's get on with the item six. Again, thank you, Ms. Madrona.
Thank you.
Council business. The next item is a public improvement contract.
Good evening, Mayor and Councilors. My name's Erica Rooney, Engineering Director, and with me tonight is Crystal Shum, our Project Manager for the Boones Ferry Road project. We're happy to be here on a very momentous occasion to finally, we hope, award a construction contract for the Boones Ferry Road project, and I'm going to let Crystal do a presentation on that. We do have other staff from our project team in the audience who'd be happy if we get into any details or anything like that. We'll be able to answer questions for you. So, Crystal, I'll let you
All
go.
right, so thank you very much. Today we're coming to you for the award of a public improvement contract to Wildish Standard Paving Company. We're really excited to bring Wildish on board for this, for the construction of this project. So just to remind you, back in November of last year, we came to you all to approve a competitive proposal selection process that we used. And some of the benefits for that were the RFP required our contractors to respond to some selection criteria, like what are your past projects? Do you have projects that are similar to ours? That we received proposals from committed and qualified contractors because it was a lot of work for them to do this. We know that it was definitely an effort that they don't usually go through, and that only the contractors that wanted this project would actually go through doing. And then we have the final selection is based on both qualifications and cost. So it's not just cost, but we can add in their qualifications so that we can get the best value for our project. So through our process, we had a proposal. They had to have a written proposal come into the city. We reviewed that separately. The selection committee did. Our selection committee was made up of 4 staff and 2 of our construction management team. And then once we got those proposals, we received 6 of them, all from really high-quality contractors. We then scored those proposals, sent out the scoring, and then they had over 200 points, they were allowed to come to an interview. Well, everybody scored over 200 points. So we, at that time, invited everyone for interviews. However, at that time, 2 of our proposers actually withdrew from the process. So between the proposal and the interview, the points that they received for that was 60%. And then once we finished the interview process, which was a fascinating process, it was a good chance to learn more about the proposers and what they had to offer to us. We then had on April 30th, we actually had an publicly open bid day. So that was well attended by the proposers. And once we opened the price, we found that although Wildish didn't have their, the price was like 40% of it. Anyways, so once we opened the price proposals, we found that Wildish was actually the top candidate. So why are they the top candidate? Because they were able to bring us these things like this. This shows elements that will be in our project. We have core 10 metal like this, and we have sidewalks where we're going to have basalt rocks or blocks. So these are some of the things that they showed us, which impressed us. They were able to bring us similar projects, like this one was the West Eugene EMX. So it was, I think it's a transit kind of mall thing, but it was a street widening, and then it was a streetscape project. So you can see the elements, you can see some of our elements that we're going to have, like the stormwater planter, some plantings, the trees, the different signals, and the widening of the roadway itself. They also showed us things like this. We have in our specifications a requirement to have business accesses marked with blue cones or delineators and business access signs. So they actually showed us a picture of when they've done this before. So that impressed us. And then while we're doing this project, the contractor is also responsible for making sure that pedestrian access is maintained throughout the project. And not only maintained, but there are now requirements for the specific materials that they use to maintain what we call a T-bar, so a temporary pedestrian access route. And part of that, if you look, there's like boards on the bottom of these barriers. That's because we have to make sure that they're canable by people who have, who are blind or have low vision, so that they can cane against it and be able to find their way by themselves. So, coming to the price proposal. So Wildish's bid was $21,442, but in 8 cents. There was actually 8 cents. I dropped that.
We rounded.
Yeah, we rounded. But really what you want to know, or what you should pay attention to, is that it was actually the average of the 4 bids that we received. It wasn't the highest, it wasn't the lowest. And we feel really comfortable with this because we felt that they actually had the best qualitative score, or qualitative part of this. All right, so I think I'm talking a little fast, but now we're to the cost estimate, some of the nitty-gritty of this project. So, costs to date. So as you see in the one column, we have costs to date. And I want to point out to you that in your council report, we had construction management. I think there was a number of like $224,000 in that. We realized when we were putting this, this slide together that we had double counted that. That cost of the construction management has actually come out of the, or been included in the design, engineering, and environmental stuff, the cost to date, because that was our pre-construction work that our construction managers did. So that's kind of how that, and because of the way we budget or our budget report comes out, that got stuck in there, and I wasn't paying attention to that. So anyway, so these are our costs to date. As you can see, we spent about $12.6 million so far. That includes our staging area that we have, that all of our contractors who came to the interviews let us know how much they appreciated not having to find something, something that size, because it would have been really difficult. So they were thankful to at least have that to start with. But you can also notice the estimated future costs. So let me explain a little bit about those. So the design and engineering and environmental costs of $651,000, that's pretty much the WH Pacific EOR, so the engineer of record contract that was awarded back in December. Our property right-of-way acquisition has completed. That was, did take a little longer than we'd hoped. Our staging area has some soft costs associated with it. So we anticipate about $10,000 on that. And then construction management, that's our OTAC contract, which is $3.4 million. That was the construction contract that was awarded in December. And then project management and administration costs, those would be staff. So we're looking at the estimate of about $1 million. And then construction would be the $21,450. All right. So that all inclusive is $39 million. However, if you back out the staging area, which we plan on selling, if we get the same price, we come to $36.8 million to get us to the end of this. So, schedule. Today, we are asking you to award this contract to Wildish. We would start active construction in mid-June. They are ready to go. We've had to actually slow them down because we were like, whoa, wait a minute, we're not quite ready on our end. We need to actually sign contracts. We need to get word out that we have a project happening. So about mid-June is when we'll start to probably see some active construction. And then the duration of this project is about 2.5 years. It will really depend on some of our utility coordination that's occurring. So any questions? I feel like
Council Manager, you have a question?
Yes, I do.
That's okay. That's good.
So just so I understand this, the 37, let me back that up. The, how much are we approving today, 21? Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
21.
The 21 is firm for the services, the construction that they'll be offering?
It is the cost for the proposed estimated bid items at this point.
Proposed estimated items, and what's the plus minus on that? I mean, there must be some parameter around that?
There's not a typical parameter, but typically we try to give a contingency of 10%.
How much, 10?
10%.
Okay.
There's a lot of, quantities can be adjusted, things that could change over the next 2
Sure.
years, as they find things.
Well, on the scope of a project like this, I'm just thinking of all the
Yeah.
myriad of things that might
Yeah,
change.
10%'s a pretty reasonable.
Is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay.
Could happen.
All right, thank you.
Councilor Wendland?
So the estimated future costs for the project management administration for $1 million, that's outside costs, so that would be additional consultants or our internal costs?
That's our internal cost, our staff costs.
So, Dr. Lassenby, how does that work when you assign something to that and then we're paying for it in the regular budget? I mean, from an accounting standpoint, you need a debit and
We
credit.
do a cost accounting factor. If you look at the timesheets for the folks in engineering, it's pretty complex, so we charge back the project. So we capitalize it as part of the project.
Okay, so that's basically, so it's taken out of the budget numbers. Okay. And then the other point is just, there's a $2 million spread between the two. I understand your scoring, and the scoring was within 9 points, which is a pretty small. 871 versus 862, and I was not in the meetings, but 2 million is a fairly significant number. You feel, just by having somebody give you some visuals, I mean, was there a feeling that they had their stuff together versus the other firms that were kind of blindsided, or maybe a little wild in their estimations or not estimations? I mean, because that's a pretty big, $2 million on, it's over 10% on something like that. Wildish must have been way ahead of everyone else. Is that correct?
That is correct. So when we went through this process, Wildish had a good proposal with good examples of work that they did. They weren't the top at that point, but when they came to the interview, they they knocked it out of the park when they came to the interview. They came with their A-team, and they promised us their A-team. They came with people who have had years of experience on projects that are almost exactly the same as our project. They were able to show us that they've worked in urban business areas like the one that we have, that they've worked with within areas that have both commercial and residential areas. So we believe that this group is the group that we want. And yes, it was $2 million difference, but we believe that they also have the experience to know what the actual costs are going to be.
But we would not be held liable if they went over, right? I mean, if the costs, if they know what their costs, if they come in at 19.3 at Emery Sons and Wildish is at 21.4, that's the set cost, right?
It's not a guaranteed maximum price, no.
Oh, it's not?
Oh, no, they never are, not when we do low bids and things like that. This isn't either. If there's quantity overruns or changes in scope,
Or
that
quantity underruns.
or even underruns, it varies. That's how all of our projects are unless it's a GPM.
Okay.
Or GMP, excuse me. So it does vary. Every
Okay.
project varies. It's a rare day that when we start a project and the bid that we got, the estimate is exactly on, because things are never exactly in the field the way that they were planned to be, and there's also scope changes that can occur.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that it's always a plus, an added cost. We also have times when we have deductions to our projects. We've had several projects that, like on Kerr Parkway, we had a deduction to the cost of the project in one area because we were able to put in a different kind of wall, and that was proposed. But then on that project, we also had a water line that we added to it. So there's all these pluses and minuses that happen during the course of a project. But using the estimate that they were given, that our contractors were given to propose the cost for this project, we believe that Wildish had the expertise to know what that cost is going to be.
So you think they'll be closer to the actual cost
Yeah,
in
well,
your
I
estimation?
think what I like to think about on this is that what we're buying is quality contractor for
Right.
this. Low bid, you get low bid. And sometimes you get a contractor that is good, and sometimes, quite honestly, you don't. And what the whole point in this process, which I unfortunately, I think the two of you may not have seen it back in November when we talked about this with council, is that we may be paying a little bit extra, maybe, but we're buying that better quality countertop. We know it's a contractor that we feel is going to partner with us, come to the table, do the right thing, as opposed to, yeah, I can give you Formica, it's cheaper, but you might not like it as much. So we're buying that extra quality, and on a project of this magnitude and this complexity and this much time and effort spent, we think it's worth it to get the top candidate, the top contractor for a reasonable price. And we got a price that's
I'm
is in the
totally
middle.
supportive of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah,
Yep.
so it's
Okay.
different than what we're used to, and we've talked about this a lot too. We certainly don't want to use this on all of our projects. This would not be appropriate to use for much smaller, more traditional projects, but this is the appropriate approach, I think.
Thank you.
Yes.
Councilor Kohlhoff?
So I'm supportive of Wildish as opposed to the other ones. The question I had, done with that, the question I had is actually for Attorney Powell. I'm not sure where the $2 million, I thought we bought that property for about $2 million, give or take. Is that right?
2.25 is what we
Okay,
bought for.
so I'm not, in two questions. One being, are we obligated to sell that when we're all done? I mean, if we determined that we wanted to use that property for something else, are we in some fashion tied to selling it?
It's a good question. I have to look at, what I think is this project funding, this came from the project funding and some of the LORA funding.
Correct.
So I'll say this very tentatively, but I would think that if in fact you were going to use it for something completely unrelated to this project or a LORA project, then you would want to refund LORA or to refund the LORA account the value of that property to use it for something else. Right. You can keep it, but I think you have to make the funds whole. But it's a very tentative opinion. I need to take a look at how that was structured.
So the second question then was, we had $36 million in total. with the revised figures, 36,871,000.
Yes.
Where is the 2 million on that?
It came out, so right above that is the 39,122.
Yeah?
That's cost to date plus future costs. It's going to be a total of 39,122, minus the 2.25 for the staging area. The project itself costs 36,871.
But if we didn't sell it, it's going to cost 39 million and change. Okay.
Yes.
Councilor Lamont?
The 39 total is where we're at today, and I want to thank you for bringing the list, because it is hard for us to look at things isolated, but when you put the whole list for the project, very appreciated. And this is maybe a Manager Lasby question, if we're at 39, how are we in relationship to the Urban Renewal District as far as the funding there?
Yes, I know the engineering staff talked to the finance staff to make sure we could cover it. There is implications for the total project list for the Urban Renewal District. This is just phase one of a potentially two-phase project, and then there's a couple other items in the Urban Renewal Plan, primarily parking. And so part of our work program is to relook at the overall Lake Grove plan to see, we know we're going to need more if we're going to do all those things that were on the original list, and so it's just a matter of figuring out what kind of an increase in the debt limit do we need, should we decide to do that. It would be your decision as a LORA board as to whether to do it. So the short answer is we've got enough to cover this project. We wouldn't be able to do everything in the current plan with the current debt limit without making a
Okay,
change.
so it's coming in at a good price, but it's tight. We don't have extra money for phase two yet. We'd have to rethink tools to change that, or things to do.
Is that your
Yeah,
understanding too?
That's my
Yeah.
understanding, yes.
Okay.
And don't forget, we didn't talk about it here tonight, but it's in the report. 4 million came from ODOT and 5 million came from the GO bonds. So take 9 off of that, and
Oh,
we're at
that's right.
30
So-
for the TIF money.
So 30, yeah.
About.
And that's about where we targeted for the whole thing, right? There's not a lot of extra in there then?
Probably,
Okay,
yep.
all right. Thank you.
Councilor Nguyen?
Yeah, my question is, with regards to these types of large public works projects, I mean, certainly the number is quite substantial, but in part of the RFP, looking at the criteria in how the proposals are judged, is anything in there, is there any sort of encouragement or incentive for these larger companies to create opportunities for smaller businesses, more opportunities for women and minority-owned businesses to participate? Certainly, if there's a chunk of, maybe a portion of the work that can be done.
Currently, it's not our policy, so it wasn't in our specifications to require that. But there are projects out there, especially ones that ODOT runs themselves, that do require that. That would just be, I would think, a policy that you, as the council, would ask us to put forth. But yeah, it can happen. It hasn't been our policy up to this point.
Right. The reason I bring it up is I think that, later on our agenda, I think there's going to be an agenda in regards to the diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know that that's going to be coming up, and that's a very limited scope for the task force. But maybe in a future conversation, if we were to have these opportunities where we as a city, much like ODOT does through their Office of Civil Rights, they identify maybe a portion of the work that maybe in a $20 million project, maybe 10% of that could be awarded to firms that have a supportive function, for example, maybe like site prep or some other ways that, again, the idea is to be able to, as a city, if we as a council decide this could be a part of one of our goals, is that we encourage the development and capacity building of smaller firms, local firms. And certainly when we have these criteria where, you're graded on presentation skills and how fancy of a brochure you can put together, that kind of automatically excludes some of the smaller firms that may not be able to participate. So for me, I brought it up before, I think in terms of building capacity for smaller firms and really allowing them to be able to get those tools to be able to do that. So that was my question about, again, these larger projects. I think that would be something I'd like to see, because I know that in other airport, for example, airport projects, I'm involved in those a lot. That's a requirement of the FAA.
Yeah,
that there's,
it's typically a federal requirement. It wasn't on this project for our stuff. I I think there might have been some as part of the contract that WH Pacific had with ODOT
they had
as
the
our
state
design
funds.
contract, the design contract.
I'm sure looking at this list of all these contractors, I'm sure that they're all very well familiar with these types of requirements, so it
Yeah.
wouldn't be difficult for them to do.
In fact, they had asked us, it was kind of interesting, just as a side note, that the Wildish proposal actually stated that they had a certain percentage of women that worked in their firm, in their company. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I was like, I'm not quite sure why you put that in there, but it was of interest. And then when we did talk to them, they did ask us if there was that percentage, if they had missed it in the specifications, and
Well, so if they have that,
they
I'd
would
see,
have
if,
been
you know,
willing.
it may not be like a requirement, but, certainly if they have it, certainly encourage
Yeah,
that type of
definitely.
participation.
Any further questions? That's,
Second.
The award, okay. They've been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, big day.
Next, we have a possible ordinance
Right.
We'll work on that.
for the city code to eliminate business license requirements. Mr. Powell, were you going to talk about that?
It's,
Steezing who will be
yeah.
presenting that.
Oh, all right.
You can if you would like to. So I don't have a presentation, but it'll be fairly short. Good evening, Mayor and Councilors. My name's Madison Thiesing, and I'm the Management Analyst in Public Works. My item is relatively small, about 15 words to be exact on the code change, so hopefully I cover everything you may need to know. So as you know, on January 2nd, we had come to council, Rachel Sykes as Assistant Public Works Director and myself, for the right-of-way ordinance, which is moving from individually negotiated franchise agreements to a right-of-way ordinance, which requires utilities using the public right-of-way to license and register. It's a way that we can treat utilities more fairly and consistently. This was adopted on January 2nd, which enacted Chapter 51 in the code. Largely, this creates more collaboration and communications with the city and utilities that are in the public right-of-way. Right now, we currently have Chapter 20 in the municipal code, which covers business license. In that code chapter, there is a section that talks about exemptions. One of those exemptions that is allowed is that utilities with an existing and in good standing franchise agreement are exempt from having a business license. So with that, the new right-of-way license process does not get addressed in that. So we received feedback from utilities who were going through the right-of-way license process and registration. We've been in effect about 5.5 months, so we've received a couple applications, and some of the feedback we got was that it was very redundant in the requiring a business license too. So some of the things that are required in a business license along with the right-of-way franchise registration were up-to-date contact information, state authorization to do business, an organizational chart, things like that of just who do you contact when you have a question. So with that, we regrouped as staff, so with planning, finance, the city attorney's office, public works, and we looked at our two processes and said, is there redundancy? Are we asking for too much? Are we asking for too little in these applications? And at the end of the day, they overlapped almost exactly. So one thing that we were bringing forward is to revisit those policies, being the exemption itself. We found that not only did they overlap, but we were finding that the right-of-way registration was more comprehensive because it requires an annual check-in with city staff. So we are going above and beyond just asking for someone to give a name, an email, and phone number. So with that, we are asking to expand the right-of-way, or excuse me, expand the franchise agreement business license exemption to include right-of-way license holders. It will become a more streamlined process. We won't be double charging for the exact same information essentially, and it's just more effective and efficient. So with that, that was my short spiel for 15 words of a code change. Is there any
Councilwoman, do you have a
questions?
question?
I have a second.
You have a question first. Councilwoman?
So what does the application look like for a utility to apply? How many pages is it?
It's actually an online application.
Okay.
So we created it through Laserfish, and it captures all the information, so we also have public record. It requires that they offer a organization name, a point of contact name, email, phone number, utility maps, so where their facilities are located, the linear feet, if they have linear feet, if they're renting out their utility space to anyone, so you may have, for example, the communications line. They have renters essentially, so we asked if they are renting out any of their space. We also asked if they're having any future expansion to their facilities, so we are also not only knowing what's in our right-of-way, but what could be happening next year, which is a huge piece for coordination of future projects. We also have they have to identify where they're, not only the map of where their facilities are, but if they're underground or aerial, both, and then what type of utility they have in itself.
What's the implication for staff? I mean, do we actually save time on this at all, or is there? I mean, it sounds like things like, when we want to know about future expansion, future projects, maps, and having the most updated information, but it's all online. It's not like it just seems like, if it's, Verizon or AT&T or something, it seemed like it can't be that burdensome. I mean, I don't think that I would like to believe our staff isn't creating that much work for a company like this, because certainly they're doing business in other jurisdictions that probably require even more in terms of applications. So I just want to make sure that, that we aren't shooting ourselves in the foot for every time we have somebody for a new franchise agreement to come through, that we don't have the most, or that we don't preclude ourselves from getting the most accurate information in terms of maps and future expansion, because with technology changing the way it is, certainly with 5G, whether that's at risk now with the hardware, for example, for coming from overseas, that changes can change in a matter of months, and so I think it might not be a bad idea and if it's only for applications, it's not like it's but I don't know. I'd like to see maybe potentially we keep it as is, because I think the city could benefit from knowing more about these types of projects rather than less.
Yeah, Councilor Wennon, you,
I think this is just so that they don't have to fill out the business license, right? So you have to fill out everything else. So we're getting lots more information. They just don't have to fill out the business license part.
And the point's well taken, and I think, this is a new territory for many of us, especially with the small cell and other technologies. And so we could well be before council in the future refining that aspect of it. We'll play it by ear. We don't want to ask for more information than we're actually going to use, but if there's more information we need, we'll recommend that.
any other questions? Councilor Wennon,
No.
did you want to make a motion?
I'd like to make a motion to approve Ordinance 2819.
Second?
We have a motion made and seconded. Anybody, any further discussion?
No, but thank you for the excellent work.
Thank you.
As always.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're very knowledgeable.
Oh, thank you.
All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay.
I oppose.
Yeah, okay, so Councilor Nguyen was opposed to the motion, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, next is Resolution 1934.
1935,
35, right?
35.
30, no, 6.3 is
1934.
Resolution 19-34.
There was some,
Resolution, was that?
yeah, there was a number double assigned. My apologies, it should be 1935.
Oh, all right.
On this one, Mayor and Council, this is it's just a step in furthering council's goal to complete the pathway along the Willamette River. I do have an update, though. We did send out letters to the two property owners, had not heard back from either of them, but I was contacted this morning by one of the co-owners of property at 475 Furnace, and we're setting up a meeting with co-owner and another of the co-owners in early June to talk about it. So I find that to be very encouraging. They raised some concerns in the past about trespassing their property, which I totally agree. There's been issues there, and if we can work with them to solve those. So anyway, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to come to some agreement with that property owner. That's by far our preference. We'd like to do that. We were successful for the vast majority of properties in Boones Ferry for acquiring right-of-way that way, but the council passed similar resolution for those properties too, so at least we had the backup that if they weren't at the very end, no matter all of our good faith efforts to acquire it, we still have the power to use eminent domain. And I've got to emphasize, even with eminent domain, you do pay market value, and we typically hedge ourselves just so we're sure that we're paying market value for the easement. We've had recent experience with the easements that we don't see that they really detract from the value of the property. We're not seeing that. But nonetheless, we'll have it appraised, and we will be very fair with the property owners. Beyond that, as far as the details of the resolution, I refer to City Attorney Powell. This is, again, we've used this process in the past, so.
Correct, yeah. As City Manager mentioned, this is a prerequisite to proceeding in eminent domain. In fact, it's even supposed to have negotiations after at some point. So this prevents you, in the event that negotiations are unsuccessful, from having to start the process over again. And an important part is just simply the declaration that it's necessary in the public interest, and importantly, that the project is planned in a way that will create the greatest public good as compared to the least public injury. And in this instance, as you can see, it's pretty obvious the pathway widths that will be required, or easement widths, are the same as the easement widths on the connecting pathways, some built and some pending building to the north, and they're in locations that connect in. And so no more is being proposed to be taken in the event that there is a condemnation that is necessary in the public interest to connect the pathway. So again, the staff would recommend adoption of Resolution 1935 that will give the city that flexibility in case it has to use that process to do the acquisition.
I move to approve adoption Resolution 1935.
We have one person, Councilor Mims wanted to ask.
I was just going to make a motion to approve, but
Councilor Lamont beat you to it.
I will, and we have a second. No, please, by all means.
We
Councilor
have a
Wendland,
motion made
second.
and seconded. Is any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Let's take a 5 to 10 minute break, please.
I was following Councilor Wendland's lead.
Okay, we're back in session.
My favorite.
Next item on our business is a consent agenda. And before we proceed on that, Councilor Kohlhoff, I think you had a couple of things you'd like to say about item 7.3, which is regarding the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force.
Thank you. I did. I wanted to make a couple comments. On page 2, there was a very specific charge, which was to identify barriers to participation and to increase the applicant pool. And the charge was made very specific so that it could be done in about 6 months and done to the satisfaction of the group and hopefully have nice, clear results back. Councilor Nguyen brought up that in a future task force, it's possible we could talk about contract criteria to increase participation of women and minorities, and that was brought up later. And it was well received, but not added this time, but it is certainly on everyone's radar. But the discussion, and I wanted to take just a second to go over the people that we are going to be trying to recruit. Clearly, we were not trying to foster identity politics. We were truly trying to get a number of people of different situations, races, circumstances to participate. So we do know that there were 2 huge voting blocks coming down the road, the older adults and the youth. And so there was some feedback that, geez, these people already have their own advisory committees. Why do we need to hear any more from them? And women, what does that mean? The biggest arguments I heard back were the demography of the parent. But when you look at the issue of inclusiveness, we do want to hear from, and we certainly want to encourage young families to come to our city and to participate. The business owner was another one that there were some rolled eyes, but remember, there are people in business right now, as opposed to people who were business owners or corporate heads or whatever years ago. We want to hear from the people who are right now trying to earn a living in our town. So the long and the short of the whole thing is, I'm kind of excited with what we did, and I'm very hopeful that we get a lot of applicants and we get some really good feedback. That's what I wanted to say.
You're here.
Move to accept the consent agenda, 7.1.
We have a motion made and seconded. Any discussion on that? All in favor of accepting this consent agenda?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay. Next item is information from Councilor. Anybody want to share anything with us? Councilor Mans, you evidently do.
Well, I just took a bite of a coconut macaroon, but I certainly would like to share a couple of things. I think, as I mentioned before, I had attended the Urbanism Next conference here in Portland, which was very interesting because it centered around smart city functions and where cities will be going in the future. And as if it were planned, City Manager Lazenby pointed out in his weekly report that I believe it was our IT department, had also been looking at this on a global basis. I also wanted to mention that Sid Sindero was at the conference as well, and what I would like to ask, either of the group or of staff, is that we could, in the future, set up a study session with all this information that we've gathered to share with the group, as it is one of our council goals to look at smart cities.
Okay.
That is what I had to share. One other thing, and this is kind of germane to this, and of course it could be brought up as well, is that someone had asked me if Uber and Lyft pay a franchise fee, if you will, or a usage fee, I'm not sure what it's called, to operate in Lake Oswego. So again, all of this feeding into the smart city area, if that could be something that could be looked at as well, another revenue stream, small as they may be, that we look at in putting together that study session. Thank you.
Anybody else have anything they want to share? All right, great. Mr. Lazenby, anything from the Board of
No, Mayor.
Officers? All right, in that case, we are adjourned as a city council, and we're going to re-meet as the LORA board. So I don't think you need to call a roll.
Correct.
All right. Board business, first thing is funding approval for the early work site preparation on City Hall.
And Sid Sin is doing the staff report on this. He's a project manager for the project. But I'm really pleased to see us take this step. You know, I won't be on staff to enjoy the new project, but it really is, it's a pleasure to see it begin in earnest, so.
Thank you, City Manager Lazenby, and good evening, Chair Studebaker, members of the board. The board is being asked tonight to approve approximately $8.1 million in early work for the City Hall project, and that's going to include some site work as well as material procurement. Last time we met was in early March, and at that time, the design process, we had just completed the 60% design development, and the board directed the design team to move into the construction document. So right now, we're at about 75%. And we anticipate by early July being at about 90%. And that early July is kind of a critical date because we anticipate going back before the LORA board for a final guaranteed maximum price, probably on July 16th for this. So certainly, we're at a point where it makes sense to do some of this early work, and some of the advantages to it, as noted in the staff report, includes kind of locking down 25% of the construction costs. And what that's done is helped us reduce some of the contingencies that the contractor's been covering for that construction piece. It also locks in some of the materials that we're looking at, like concrete and steel and elevator and glazing. Also, it helps us ensure that we do some of the work, critical work, especially the site work like excavation, demolition, foundation during the dry months. And then lastly, this certainly helps us keep us on schedule because we do anticipate phase one being completed, i.e. a move-in into the new City Hall, probably in March of 2021, and completing the project at the end of 2021, August, September, that time. So I understand $8.1 million is a substantial amount. We do have a clause in our general contracting contract that does say that if for any reason it's found that in the public interest that we decide to terminate the project, then we can remove ourselves from the contract at any time. At the same time, though, the contractor would be paid for whatever work that they've completed to date at the time. So if the board does approve this contract this evening, the next step would be abatement of the properties next door, and that could occur as soon as the end of the month. And then after that, so there's going to be some police training, some fire training in the building. And then demolition could be as early as mid-June, in July or so like that. So with that, I think this is a great, as the city manager said, this is a great step towards moving this project forward, and we recommend the board approve the request.
Questions? Councilor Manager, you had a question?
Yeah, I do. In locking in the cost of materials, particularly on steel, are we talking about steel for the entire structure? Because up at the top here, it says concrete, rebar, et cetera.
It does. It's also part of the steel frame structure.
It is part of the
Yeah,
steel frame
and I could,
structure.
confirm that with Howard S.
Good
Wright.
question. I may have actually taken.
Might as well continue my question while they're,
To order.
they're talking. Do we anticipate that, well, by locking in the cost, we will avoid any negative repercussions from, say, tariffs or other steel issues? Is that part of the
certainly, and-
thought process around that to a
Right,
degree?
absolutely, and the volatility and.
Of the market.
And the market,
Okay.
certainly. Right. So this is Aaron Braun, the senior project manager from Howard S. Wright, our contractor on the project. And I believe the question was if the steel was, it was more than just the rebar, but it was also through the structure of the building.
EWE1 includes the rebar steel as well as steel associated with the glass and glazing system. It does not include the 300 tons of structural steel. I can't say that we've bid that out since EWE1 has been submitted to the city, and that was under our budget. And a lot of this whole thing has to do with price certainty, which we're certainly gaining at this point.
And at what point do you bid out the structural steel?
As I just mentioned, we've already bid out structural steel. It was after EWE1 that we've bid it out, and we're vetting it through bidders to make sure we have complete
I
coverage.
see what
So-
you're saying.
So we have that certainty already on steel pricing.
That's good.
It is
We
very
like
good.
that.
We do, yes.
Very good.
Any other questions?
Can we move to authorize LORA Executive Director to amend the existing construction management and general contractor contract for site preparation and material procurement work in the amount of $8,107,796.08?
Second?
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Sin, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next thing is Block 138 Disposition and Development Agreement Amendment to expand uses for the ground floor.
And Mr. Sin has this one as well.
It should be a short one. So the board is being asked to expand the uses on the ground floor level on the State Street side of Lakeview Village. Currently, the use covenants that was established back in 2003 restricts those ground floor uses in Lakeview Village to either restaurant, retail, or hotel. And that was primarily to ensure that we try to have a active pedestrian and active retail. But since then, Graymore Development and Matt Grady is representing that owner and developer. They've requested to expand those uses to include health, financial, real estate, and office uses, very similar to what the Windward had requested. I think it was back in December. And they're citing it's always been difficult to retain tenants along that street, especially with Highway 43 there. And also, there has been also some impact with e-commerce. So these expanded uses, they feel does provide them a little more flexibility and still brings that economic vitality and activity into the downtown area. So with that, the staff would recommend approval.
Anybody have any questions of Mr. Sin? Then I guess I'll make a motion then that we amend the disposition and development agreement for Block 138 to expand the uses for
I think there's a presentation.
presentation too.
So.
If the board would like a quick presentation, if not, we can move.
I think we
Okay.
get the drift.
Okay.
We're good.
Okay, so my motion still is to authorize
Before we
the
say-
executive director.
Before we make a decision, I have to point out a potential conflict of interest. Graymore is a landlord of one of my businesses in the Cruz Village, so there probably isn't a material conflict of interest, but just wanted to err on the cautious side and put that out there, so.
Okay. Let me see if I can read this thing. Then.
Would you like
Motion
me
would
to
be
do
to move to authorize the executive director to execute a second amendment to the April 17, 2001 Disposition and Development Agreement and Use Covenant of Block 138 to allow fitness, health, and beauty services, financial institutions, healthcare, office, and real estate services on the ground floor along State Street for a portion of Building B and all of Building C.
Second.
Had a motion made, and second. Councilor Koloff, you had a question.
No, I have a comment.
All right.
So I'm very reluctant to go along with this. If you're a shopper and you have businesses, like I was just in Prineville, and was walking down the main drag, which is Highway 26, they had title companies, they had family counseling, they had a building called a chiropractic wellness center, and this was on the main drag, that had Edward Jones, a title company, and a hospice center. This is not shopping. This isn't what I thought that we were supposed to be doing in a supposedly vibrant shopping situation. I understand why we did what we did for Windward, because it was a brand-new project, and we certainly wanted them to be successful there on A Street and not have empty fronts. Highway 43 is kind of a mess, and we continue to cloud that issue by allowing, with a code change, what would the term be? It'll allow them to build closer to the road. So I think that I'm doing something wrong. And also, I'm aware that there could be other people who are going to possibly develop around the downtown core. They're going to be saying the same thing. So before you know it, you don't really have a shopping center. You don't have browse around or go have lunch or dinner. And I guess the thing that bothers me the most is the anecdotal belief that retail is going down, that somehow we all buy off of the internet. And maybe there are people similar to myself who do both. I know people who go to even the mall and they have something in mind, they go straight to that object and they leave. And then there are plenty of people who are mosiers. How do I know what I want until I've looked around? So I really would prefer not to have this happen and prefer to have stuff in the spaces that are interesting, that are fun to go to look at, to purchase.
Okay, Councilor Wynn.
Yeah, my comment is, I kind of want to know from the developer standpoint, in terms of the parking ratio that's currently there right now. It seems like we've got the parking available there, but one of my biggest concerns that I've seen over at Cruz Village, for example, is that when we had a heavier focus on fitness uses, for example, in particular, because we have an issue where at the Cruz Village, we've got a lot of the spaces there's a cycling, there's a bar 3, there's other types of fitness uses. And so all of a sudden, people that are coming at the newer hour or what have you, they're all driving independently, and all of a sudden you've got 25 people in a cycling class and another 25 in a bar 3 class and another class. So quickly you're up to a few dozen cars that would not be there otherwise. And so I want to be really careful that if we do approve this, I don't mind the financial institutions, the medical, dental, but in particular, I think the fitness is that tricky one, because, I don't know that people will go and carpool 5 or 6 people into one vehicle and to go to their fitness class. Because I think that right now, I look at the success of the farmer's market. this opening day, this Saturday, it was amazing to see the parking lots were full. And that's something that really adds to the vitality of that community there. I'm concerned that in terms of again, having these high, a high concentration of people coming to these uses where they'll bring in lots of cars, we might not be able to facilitate all and as well as the current restaurant uses there, because we've seen, again, I keep going back to Cruz Village. It's a great location, a great opportunity, but I think there might have been a missed opportunity to really think about how the mix of retail tenants can add or take away from the availability of parking. So I'd like for you to speak on that a little bit if you can.
Good afternoon, Council, LORA Board. My name is Matt Grady. My address is 19767 Southwest 72nd Avenue, Suite 100, Tualatin, Oregon, zip code 97062. I'm the VP of Director of Development for Graymore Development. I've been there for 20 years. I was involved directly with the building of this Block 138, as well as Block 137, as well as Cruz Village. And you asked me to talk about the parking ratios and what's happening at Cruz Village.
No, and how that would happen.
Or how it would impact here. Well, here we did an experiment in 2015. We actually got a real estate firm to be down on the portion of that segment of Block B, Building B, I should say, Building C, rather. And it's been there for 2015. Since 2015, it's been very successful, and it's got nice open glass. People can see in there, and it's inviting. There's lights on at nighttime. And we have decided that we have some other leases coming up relatively soon, and we've been watching and managing other centers that we have, and everybody's demanding services. They want things that they can't get off the internet. So you can go and look and buy clothes, but like you said, restaurants have become very popular. And places where you can get exercise become more popular, certainly, but people still need to get eyes, they need to get ears, they need to get acupuncture, they need to get chiropractic help, and all these different kinds of uses which don't fall under either hotel, restaurants, or straight out retail where you can go buy a pair of shoes, or, Glassy Baby is a wonderful, wonderful shop. We're so lucky to have them right on that corner, and the same with Sur La Table, and we want to keep them there forever. But there's a tide, which is something that we can't control, which is this desire and demand for services. And so we need to have some options. And the best place we could ask for this is in this location. And so it's a limited amount of space. It's a total of, right here, it's a total of 6,900 square feet that we're asking for on State Street side only. So it's be limited geographically to the State Street side. So we don't believe that that's going to have a catastrophic or even minimal impact on parking. We don't like to have a lot of exercise places where we talk amongst, when we go lease, about consumptive uses which come at off-peak times or peak times. Mm-hmm. And we know Cruz Village is interesting. It only has 249 spaces. It's surrounded by the biggest block of office concentration in the city. And it's popular, and lunchtime is the maximum time where everyone is looking for something. And there's no off-street parking, so there's no parking in neighborhoods going on either. And so we have a unique situation there. And here, you now actually have, we were always concerned that the Windward would be parking people into this garage because it might be easier to go up instead of down, and whether there's more or less spaces, but there's 365 spaces there. And we have office users on the very, very top, which give way to the restaurants at nighttime. And so we don't think it's a detrimental effect to us. We wouldn't have come here before you if we didn't think that would be an issue.
Would you be willing to revise the proposal and maybe remove the fitness part of it out of the request?
I guess we could consider that.
That's my biggest concern, is that the fitness.
The Windward had fitness as well.
Yeah, but I don't think we need two fitnesses on both sides. I recognize that I think that was approved over there, but I think that, again, it's just I'm very hesitant about getting too many fitness places downtown and it's going to impact your existing tenants that are currently there, the restaurants up there. And I think what's unique about that shopping center, which is great with all the restaurants, is that there's always abundant parking. I think that's a draw, so we want to be careful that we don't
We are the first ones, as the owners and operators,
Yeah.
to be cautious of that, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
Councilor Mans.
Oh, okay. Thank you to my colleagues for pointing out their desire for parking and shopping. I too love to shop, but the reality of the situation is that retail, as we have known it, especially we of a certain age, is tapering off and will eventually, I don't want to say cease to exist, but will consist of either chains who can afford to stay in locations, or boutiques, or something so specialized that people feel the desire to go into the stores. Worse than having fitness or commercial in what is known as a retail district, to me, is having empty storefronts. I know that the real estate company that we approved, that condition of usage, has been very successful. I've gone to some of their, whatever they have, wine nights, or and it's a perfect location for that. State Street is difficult, and I will grant you that, especially along that corridor, because people are rushing to get home. They're not paying attention to the shops. I can see your difficulty there. That might drive retail back up into your empty spaces on A Avenue, which would be delightful, because I know you have a couple of vacant.
We have some in transition right now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, is that the word we use? In transition right now. I will remember that, thank you, I love buzzwords. So I would be amenable to this change that's proposed.
Councilor Lamont.
In all the downtowns and main streets I've worked on across the country, the ones that are on 4 lanes, 43-style corridors are the toughest for retail, and we can't kid ourselves that retail is going to go on that street. I think as development goes on from North Anchor north, we're going to be in the same boat. We probably won't get much retail around the street because people are going to walk all the way out there on a busy street, and I'm hoping we even get bigger sidewalks and setbacks in future development. The other side of the coin, as I mentioned before, is if it's a professional office that people aren't really going to visit, then that's something that we don't want, and I think you're going to self-regulate that. But the uses that are listed here, just like we had on Windward, are uses that are drawing people to the downtown. I think Councilor O'Neill and I were just talking about how active downtown has been lately on the weekends. And some of these spas, beauty salons, financial institutions are drawing a lot more than even the retail shops. So they're putting bodies on the street that then do things before or after they go to do whatever they're going to do. So I think we're talking about commercial services that will help liven up that 43 and keep it live. And as I think Councilor Mann just said, will draw people back into the main street, which is A and First, to hopefully get more retail. So I don't think this is a problem. I also think that you've got a lot of capacity for parking. This is one of the better parking developments I've ever seen in the country, where you're wrapping it up above, mostly up above grade. If somebody was to come in with a big user, they could fill the top up during the day, at night, and then in the weekends, you obviously have the off-peak. So I think I'm fine with this. I think we've got to move on with it and help get this set up and get some of these storefronts activated.
Okay, we have a motion made and seconded. Any further discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed?
Opposed.
I recuse.
Got 5 to 1 with 1 recusal. But the next item on our agenda is approval of LORA meeting minutes for March 5, 2019, and a special meeting, both of them special meeting on March 5, 2019.
Move to approve.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay, that's it. We are adjourned. Thank you.
Did we do
everybody.
19 as well? March 19th?
Mayor Studebaker, we are going to now move into an executive
Executive
session.
session.
Oh, wait.
What? No.
Oh, beg your pardon, I
That's been
didn't
I
get the
think,
memo.
yeah, March 5, 2019, both of them were special meeting minutes.
What about the March 19th? I show March 19th.
Yeah, March 5th and March 19th.
And mine is,
It's a mistake.
mine is a typographical.
it should be 19th.
All right, so we'll be back in session. I'm asking all those in favor of approving the minutes for March 19, 2019.
No.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm going to say, yes, I'll approve, but I'm really concerned with page 3 of 3. I realize the person who does these minutes has a talent and has a way of expressing it. But I'm concerned where it says, on page, this is the March 19th one, it says, Member Lamont favored a detailed, accelerated, consolidated timeline with milestones described and the financial considerations proposed at the last board meeting. My preference for this issue and this particular set of minutes is that we be more specific, because this has already caused some confusion, and it can't be that difficult to have the video checked and have more specific data in there.
I'm happy to come back with those minutes after reviewing the video to see if we can extract further detail.
Counselor Kohoff, are you saying that I went into more specific detail when I made that?
I thought you did, because I was really surprised that as we talked more, that people were saying, no, that this wasn't an expectation or this wasn't a detail. It's perfectly, it said, it goes on, Mr. Powell said the performance schedule in the current agreement would be revised and would be a major part of the discussions with the applicant. If I'm wrong and nothing further was added, then I'm wrong.
Why don't we just go ahead and take those and look at them at the next board meeting?
Oh, that would be my preference.
Again, thank you very much. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
And packed already. No.
I thought we were. Scott, are we?
Cancel.
No, not yet.